I can't see the video, Molly.
Oh, weird. Well, we're live. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. This is Alex, and welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel for this Sunday night. Today, we're pleased to have Alistair Symon here. He's going to be telling us about how to create wide field mosaics. I missed last week because I was exploring Bryce Canyon and other very dark places in the United States. But I actually saw it sitting there in my RV freezing, but I didn't have enough bandwidth to participate much in the show. I want to tell you a little bit about some stuff we've got coming up. Alistair's here today. Joe DePasquale is here with us, and he's actually here tonight too. He helps bring us the images from the Space Telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope, and he'll be here next week telling us how they do that magic, and it's really magical stuff. Ray from Ray's Astrophotography will be coming here to tell us about what he's learned from the Mars opposition during this last month. And then Andrew Campbell is going to be here finishing up the program. You might remember about 3-4 weeks ago, we had Molly's internet connection blew up, and so we lost the connection at that point. So we've got another 3 weeks, and then you can see that we're kind of running out of presenters here, and we are going to take the 27th and the 3rd off for the holidays, but we do have 3 weeks there where we do need presenters. And then when we come back, we will, Robert Buckheim will be telling us a little bit about doing science with with your imaging rigs. And he's always does a really great job of that. So we really do need the presenters. Please hit the contact button up here. And when you see the contact button, give us your first and your last name. And you know what? I don't know if I ever started sharing my screen, but I'll skip that for right now. And let me make sure that you're all ready to go. Alistair, you about ready to go over there?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, go ahead and start sharing your screen and start the
All
presentation.
Right. Okay, hopefully you are now seeing my screen.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so my name's Alistair Symon. I'm a keen amateur astrophotographer. You can see my website address on this title slide. So if you want to go look at any of my images after this talk, but if you want to email me any questions afterwards, feel free. You can find my email address on the website. So anything that might confuse you in what I go through, obviously you can ask you questions as we go along here, but I'll be able to answer anything you've got on email. I enjoy helping other astrophotographers as others have helped me in the past. Okay, so what are we going to cover here in this session? So I'm going to cover basics. What are mosaics and why would you want to take them? How do you plan it? Because that's part of the process here. You've got to do a careful plan up front. What the processing workflow is I use, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the individual image processing because the interesting bit is how you take them then and build mosaics out of them. And so I'm going to assume that everybody, obviously on this channel probably knows how to do the basic image processing that would start that off. And then we're going to talk about how we register and combine these into a wide field mosaic. But then I'm going to talk a bit about something I've been experimenting with in the last 18 months, which is creating really wide field mosaics, but using images taken at different focal lengths, which can actually save you quite a bit of time in actually the image acquisition as well as the processing. So what's a mosaic? Well, basically it's multiple images which overlap. As you can see here, 4 images taken, they've all got overlaps. They've got different brightnesses. They may have slightly different color casts based on different sky conditions at night. But you take them, you overlap them, you put them together, you find a way to make them all homogeneous in terms of the color and brightness, and then you crop it to taste. And you've got a single image that's a much bigger field of view than the 4 you started with. That's the simple premise that we're working with here. Now, why would you choose to do that? Well, there's a few different reasons. One, your CCD chip, and this was very true in the past, it's not so true now with the larger detectors, but your CCD chip could be too small to capture the entire object that you want to do. But the one that really gets me doing the wide field ones is you want to show an object in context. For example, you can see below, you might take a single image of the Rosette Nebula, but if you were to do a mosaic and do 5x2, so 10 images taken together at that single image size, you can create a much wider field of view that shows all the connections between the Cone Nebula and the Rosette Nebula. And that's really a lot of what drives me in mosaics, is showing that connection between two different objects that otherwise you just don't get from single images. And possibly the last one is you enjoy a challenge, because it can, if you're making very, very large mosaics with maybe tens of images in, that's where the challenge comes in. But I would encourage everyone to start with, if you haven't done it already, start with a 2-image mosaic. I think the North America and Pelican Nebula are a great start with that, because you do 1 image for North America. Traditionally, that doesn't fit. That just fits on one image. Do a Pelican, put it together, 2-image mosaic. Nice way to start the process. And I'll show you how you get to that point. So just briefly, what do I use to take my images? And this is just so you kind of get some of the image scales that I use when creating these. I've got 2 camera setups effectively in one mount. One that I use with an FSQ 106, with a STXL 11002 with a 35mm chip. And that's what I would call my higher resolution wide field setup, because I'm imaging there at 3.5 arc seconds a pixel. And then piggybacked on top of that, and you can see a close-up of that on the right, I've got another STXL 11000 with an 85mm camera lens. And that has a much larger image scale of 22 arc seconds per pixel. And when I come to the end of this discussion and we talk about how to create wide field mosaics using different focal lengths, you'll see exactly why I added that second camera setup, because it saves me a lot of time when I go very, very wide field. So that's the setup I use. Now, before I just carry on, I'm just going to check everyone can still see my screen and hear me okay.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to go into how you plan the mosaic, because planning is really, really key here, because to get a mosaic that you can build successfully, your images have to overlap to a certain extent. And so how do you ensure that that happens as part of this process? Well, the way that I do it, and I'm sure that I'm going to show you the software that I use, but there'll be other applications out there that let you do similar things. I do my planning in the SkyX. It has a very nice feature where it lets you define the field of view of your camera and telescope setup, and also can draw a little box for where your guide star may go on your guide chip. And so you can align against an image at the right field of view. Here's the Rosette Nebula, and there's a nice big guide star that's shown here right in the guide chip. So that would be how I'd line up on a single image. And then what I do with that is I would typically import that coordinates of that field of view from the SkyX into software that I use to capture the image with my automated setup. But you could take the coordinates down from that field of view and plug it into whatever software you're using to set the telescope up to the right point. But you set yourself up on that first image. Now, if you want to, with the SkyX, it's got this really nice inbuilt mosaic grid feature that can help you plan mosaics. So having set your first field of view like this, you can actually go into this mosaic grid feature within the SkyX, and you can tell it how many images you want in terms of number of rows and number of columns, and you can specify the percentage overlap down in here. In this case, I've got a 20% overlap for each image. So that tells it it wants to draw boxes at that image scale and overlap them 20%. And it will then just draw this image grid And the great thing is that you can then import the whole image grid into automation software without having to do and find the 10 separate image positions in the sky and import them individually. So that's a way of planning your grid out nicely from within the software, so you don't have to do it individually. But however, if the kind of drawback with the method I just described is when you draw that grid, it's kind of assuming that wherever your telescope is going to point at each element in the grid, there's going to be a guide star on your guide chip. And I used to use a setup where that wasn't true. And so I would go back, take that image scale with the guide chip and the guide star nicely centered on it. And then what I would do is I'd go use that coordinates, take the image over a night or several nights, and then I'd come back to the SkyX, and basically I'd move my image box a bit to the left, doing it by eye, but being careful just to check that it was going to be overlapped to a certain extent with the prior image that I took. And I would use that then to get the coordinates for the next image. And I would repeat that process for all 10 images in the mosaic. So when it comes to kind of taking the images, I've been using a program called CCD Autopilot. There are many other automation programs that you can use for automating your setup with your telescope and your mount and your camera. I just chose to use Autopilot. It's got a nice feature where I can use this get button because it links to the SkyX, and wherever my field of view indicator is in the SkyX, it will import those coordinates direct into the imaging plan. If I've used a mosaic grid setup with the 5x2 that we looked at earlier, I can click the mosaic button and it imports the entire array that was created there of 10 images, and it labels them A1 through A10. And it's done that all at a single click of a button. But again, you can import one image at a time into your software, just moving that field of view to the right point, image after image. So that's what I do to create an image plan. And really the key is the overlap on the images. And what you're trying to get to is about 10 to 20% overlap between each image. And the reason for the overlap is twofold. Obviously, you've got to have a nice seamless join between the two images, but more importantly, the overlap's going to get used in the registration process between the images. And you've got to have enough stars shared between the two images for the registration software to really be able to align them so that they're all perfectly formed as you're building the mosaic up. So that's the planning phase. I kind of mentioned I use an automated software for that, CCD Autopilot. It does make it a lot easier because it will center each image from the plan, plate solve it, camera rotate if necessary, though I don't use camera rotation anymore. It will do the automated focusing, and it will do the meridian flip. And this will just let you take images all night while you sleep, which is a great thing if you're trying to go really deep on objects. But I can absolutely assure you it's possible to do this without automation software. When I started my first mosaics, I did not have an automated setup. I used that single image import coordinates from the SkyX. I would get my telescope aligned with a trial image in approximately the right position, use my Sky software to get it absolutely then lined up. And then I would just image that image one night and move it to the next image location from SkyX the next night. And it just takes longer. Automating always just makes it simpler for you to do. So typically, for a typical image that I would use as one image in a mosaic, I would take about 3 to 6 hours of data for the luminance, or 3 to 6 hours for H alpha frame, and then about 1 to 2 hours of data in each color channel, so red, green, and blue. And I would typically bin everything one by one. I've used 2x2 binning in the past, but these days I pretty much do everything one by one, and 10-minute subframes. And so that's how the images get taken and accumulated. Now we're going to get into the processing strategy and how we do this now. So the way this is done is each image I would actually process as a separate image in its own right before doing the mosaic. So I would take all the data for one of the images in the mosaic through luminance, red, green, and blue filters. I would process that as a complete processed LRGB image before I did anything to do with stitching the images together to create the mosaic. Now, you might ask, well, why wouldn't it be easier to do a mosaic of all the red images together in monochrome, and then another mosaic with the green and then with the blue? But if you did that, the reason I don't do that is because there's going to be, as you'll see, you've got to do a lot of adjustments of the brightness, the contrast of each of the images to get them to blend well together, because they're going to be taken at different times under different sky conditions. And if you were to try and do that with the red layer, you'd get a very nice monochrome looking red layer. And then if you did it with the green layer and the blue layer, they'd look great. But if you combine them together, you'd find that the color in each of the areas, each different image is going to be slightly different, because you've stretched each of the red, greens, and blues in the same image section differently to get them to match in their individual mosaics. So I always create the LRGBs as a whole, and then I start to stitch together the mosaic. So in this case, we're going to actually go through the process that I used to create a picture of that Widefield mosaic of the cone to the rosette. And so down here in the bottom left, you'll see these are these 10 images that I talked about that I would take and process. And you can see there's individual images in there. You can see they do not, while they're all registered and there's no joins between them at this stage, look at the different brightnesses that's in each of the images. You can see that's that thing I was talking about having to get each of these images very carefully matched to each other, and why I do it at this stage versus the different color channels. And then I'll take you through the process of lining these up like this. We'll go through how you make those kind of different brightnesses go away. And that's the finished LRGB mosaic you get after that work. And then, because there's a lot of hydrogen alpha in this particular region, I happened to do a hydrogen alpha mosaic, and I did process the hydrogen alpha mosaic as a mosaic in its own right, because of the way I then combine that with the LRGB data. And I thought I would actually show you the way I do a hydrogen alpha combined in this mode, because it's maybe not the typical way that everybody does it. And I find it's actually something that I like to explain to people, because I think you might find that useful for even non-mosaic images. So when you combine the hydrogen alpha with the LRGB, there's the finished result. So we're going to go through exactly how we do this for this particular image now. Now, the one thing that I would ask you to do when you're processing each of your individual LRGB images is to use the same workflow for each one. Follow the same steps, because you're going to get closer brightnesses and contrast adjustments, contrast between each of the individual images if you follow the same processing steps for each of the images. They're not going to be identical. There's always going to be some adjustment. But if you use a widely different process between processing one image and the next, it's going to make your end combination project that much harder. So try and stick with the same process and workflow for each of the images. For me, I do all of my calibration in CCD Stack. The key software, and I'm going to show you this software in some detail, that I use to register all the images, which is key to building a mosaic, is a piece of software called Registar. Now, there are other pieces of software out there that do that now. There's a piece of software I was about to look into myself, but haven't done yet, called Astro Pixel Processor. And that also has a mosaic capability. But I use this software called Registar. It's relatively cheap, quite basic, but it does a fantastic job of registration. And for me, that was what enabled me to really get going with mosaics. I had tried image registration in different packages. I tried MaxMDL, I tried Images Plus, and I couldn't get registration to be nailed on 100% of the time, especially with things like narrowband images like hydrogen alpha. And this process this software really enabled that. The other thing that I use then is I do my outlier pixel rejection to get rid of satellites, trails, plane streaks, etc., with the statistical rejection and CCD stack. And then I'll just create an averaged image, as you're probably all familiar with. But then I do the whole rest of my process typically is in Photoshop. I have not used PixInsight. I know that's another great program. I know a lot of you will be using that. I think some of the techniques that I talk about here translate well to PixInsight, but I have not used it. So I will be showing you how I do this in Photoshop. I think last time I gave this presentation, I was told I was a bit old school, but it works for me. And if PixInsight works for you, that's great. I just happen to use this and I've stuck with it. So I'll go through levels and curves with the image. I'll use gradient removal using Russell Cromer's gradient exterminator. I'll then do some further contrast enhancements. I'll use sharpening with unsharp masks and high pass filters. I'll take my H alpha through HDR toning in Photoshop to get an even better high definition image. And I'll do noise reduction with Noise Ninja. I'm not going to go through that process here because I think the interesting bit is how to take single images that you're familiar with and how to do, and then how do you make the mosaic itself. So what's the best process to do this? And there's a couple of ways that that you could do it. And the way that I'd read about originally was, well, you could take a low resolution image, a very big wide field image of the area of the sky you're going to look at. Maybe it's a DSLR image, but something wide field, very wide field, lower resolution than you're going to end up doing. Scale that image up and use that as the master image to align all your high resolution images to. But I didn't really have a good way of doing that at the time, so I invented what I would have called an iterative approach. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to take two images and we're going to register them together to make a 2-image mosaic and blend them together to form a final 2-image mosaic. And then we're going to add a third image to that. And then we're going to repeat that process. And then you can add a fourth and a fifth, and you can just keep going iteratively until it's done. So you don't absolutely have to go and take a kind of lower resolution image to register everything to. An iterative approach works really well for most images, and it's worked very well for me. So let's talk about how we might do that. So here's what Registar looks like. We're now looking in the registration software, because it's going to be the key vehicle that I show you for being able to get images that were taken with this 20% overlap and then align them and allow them to be easily imported into Photoshop, which then lets you easily blend them together. So basically what I've got in this screen here, on the right-hand side is a single image of the Rosette Nebula. On the left-hand side is a single image of what's to the left-hand side of this image here. And if you look carefully, you can just about see that there's some stars that are overlapped here. That star's overlapped there, that's there. And we want to join those two images together, register the overlap precisely. So what we do is we bring up this registration control window, and we've selected, in this case, the left-hand image, and we're going to register it to the Rosette image over here, which is fully processed. And I'm going to click this little union thing here, which says I want to create a union of these two images. I want you to register it, and I want you to create an image that's as big as both images combined. That's what the union option does. And then you hit register. It really is as simple as that, leaving everything else defaulted. And what happens is you get this. So what this is showing you is this red image is the left-hand image. You can see it's overlapped here in this kind of shaded area between the two. There's the right-hand Rosette image. It's worked out the registration exactly just using these overlapped areas. And now we've got an image that is in size the union of these two images. And in this case, I've got the left image, and what you can't tell until you save this image is over here, when you import it into Photoshop, where the Rosette is, it's all padded with black. So you've got all this image, and then you've got black padding over here. If you save this and import it into Photoshop, that's what it would look like. So we've got our left-hand image registered. But now what we need to do is we need to go to the Rosette image, and we need to now make it as big as this union we just created of these two images. And so to do that, Registar has this little thing called the crop pad control. So I select my rosette image. It will automatically have picked that I wanted to do something with the other image in here, which is the rosette left image. And I create my union again, and I hit OK. And what that will then do is it will create a single image here with the rosette cropped or padded out in this case to be the same size as this one we created earlier. And now the black padding will be to the left of the Rosette Nebula. Here it was to the right of the left-hand image. So now I've got two images exactly registered, exactly the same size that I can save and import into Photoshop. So save them as TIFFs, and away you go into Photoshop at this stage. So what you see here is when I've opened Photoshop up, and I'm going to presume that you know a little bit about Photoshop. I'm not going to go into a lot of details as to how it works, but what you do in this case is you've imported both images. You would select one. In this case, I selected the rosette image with its black padding to the left. You can see the black padding over here. I selected it, I copied it, and then I pasted it into the image that contained the left image with the padding to the right. And I've got two layers in this image now. I've got the layer that you see here with the rosette image, and underneath it, this background layer, you could actually, if you were able to see into that little box, there's the left-hand image underneath this layer one. So now I want to let the left-hand image show through so I can start to do some blending. So what I do is I did a little selection box, a rectangular selection through Photoshop over the black padding area, and I cut the pixels. And when you cut the pixels, once you've selected that area, oh, like magic, there you can see now the left-hand image is shining through into the main view. Now we still have this, obviously, this black piece here that I didn't cut away, because what I want to do now is I want to create a seamless blend between these two images. So how would you go about doing that? Well, the way to do that in Photoshop is to create a mask. And I know that PixInsight, for example, also has masks, so you can do the same approach there. What you do is you create the mask. In this case, I'm going to create a mask over the rosette image, and I'm going to have a mask that lets everything still be revealed. So that's what this little white box is here. It's the reveal all mask. And then what I can do is I can take a paintbrush from over here. I'll take select the paintbrush icon from the palette here, and then I can paint on the image. I would paint black, but I'm doing it while I've got this mask selected. So when I paint black in this point here, it's actually going to obscure bits, this black strip and this bit from the rosette image, and let show through this left-hand image, which is overlapping. So when you paint over that join, it looks like this. I've now painted over that join. And if you look in here, that little black strip is where I painted. That black strip is obscuring the rosette image. And now I've got the seamless join. Well, not quite seamless yet, but there's no black strip. But look what you've got, right? Now you can see what the difficulty is now we're going to have to work on. These images are not quite identical in terms of their brightness and their contrast. And in some cases, their color as well is different. So we're going to have to do a piece of work now in the Photoshop, and it's going to be manual and it's going to be subjective. There's a lot of subjectivity to this until you feel it looks right. So what's the first thing that we can see that's wrong with these two images? Well, the first thing is this image on the left-hand side, it's too bright. The background is much brighter than the background in the rosette. So we need to deal with that. So the way to deal with that in Photoshop is to go into the curves function and correct that. So we select the background image, which is actually the left-hand image of the two, and we'll use the curves function to drop the background down a little bit. And you can see here, that looks a bit closer, starting to look a little bit better now. It's a bit more evenly matched. So we'll okay that, and then we'll move on to what's next. Now, if we look at what's next, if you look at this upper right-hand region, that's brighter here than it is there. So we might want to go and correct that. So the way we do that is we'll draw a selection around the area that we now want to operate on. And we're still selected on the left-hand image underneath. And so this curves function I'm going to do now is going to work on this bit of the image here. And I'm going to make it a bit brighter to match the image on the right. Now, I could have done it the other way around. I could have selected the rosette image and made this area a bit darker. Again, it's all subjective and how you think what's best for the image itself. But we needed to do something on one of those two images, and I chose to do brighten the left-hand one in this little region here that's selected. So with that curve function, you can see it starts to look a bit more seamless. But now as well, you can see that the lower right region of the left-hand image is a bit brighter still than the left hand of the image to the right. So we're going to go and correct that now. Same technique. Again, we select the area we want to operate on the left-hand image, and we bring down the background a little bit more so it's a bit more seamless. And now it's starting to look a bit more like there isn't any join or differences, and it truly is a single image. Now, just subtly in this case, it was looking like there was a slight color adjustment between the two images. It probably doesn't show through very well on the slide, but what was done here is to adjust the color background in the green channel again on the left-hand image, just so the color balance looked a little bit more even between the two. And just tweaking the green channel on the left-hand image was enough to do that. Finally, there was a bit more brightness in this right-hand image in the center region. And so again, selection round here of what I want to do. And now I'm selected on the Rosette Nebula this time, and I'm going to darken this part here so that it's a bit more reasonable. Again, pulling down on the curves, and now it starts to look more reasonable. And so there you are, two images, pretty well blended. I would argue, now I've done a lot more of these mosaics. I would argue I could have gone further because I still think it looks a bit too bright out here, but it's not bad at this stage. And so what you would do is flatten this image down to make one image out of the two, and you save this as a single image as a TIFF file. And so we've got our two image mosaic, and now we're going to iterate. So iteration, back into Registar. Now I've imported my two image mosaic that I just created. That's this one down here. And I've got this new single image, which is called Rosette Upper. So it's an image taken above the Rosette Nebula. I've kind of lined it up so you can kind of see how that goes, but we need to register these two images together exactly and create an image that's as big as all three of these images now. So again, we use the registration. We've selected the Rosette Upper. We select this the Rosette bottom row that we created earlier, and we use that union command again. I'm going to create a union of this image with the two image mosaic, and we're going to let Registar do that. And away it goes again. And now we've got our third image registered with the two image mosaic. This time it's all a union that's a big square like this. When we import this into Photoshop, all this will be black around the image we just registered. It will be padded out. But now we need to go back to our two image mosaic, and we need to make that padded to be the same size as the three image one we just created. So we go back to the two image one, we go to the crop pad function, we do the union command again, and we've now made this image the same size as the three image mosaic that we just created with the previous register command. So again, I've got two images, absolutely identical in terms of their size, all aligned correctly. I can import those two images into Photoshop, and I can blend that new single image with the two image mosaic. And you just keep going through this process every time you add an image. It sounds like it's a lot when you take it in for the first time, but when you get proficient at this, I can do a 6-image mosaic in about 30 minutes. When you really get familiar with the commands, get familiar with the areas you have to tweak in terms of the brightnesses and the color contrast, it really you can get very quick at it with a bit of practice and experience. So that's how you would iterate to create that. So there you go. You do 10 of those images. That's your LRGB mosaic. Now, as it happens, we still have to do our hydrogen alpha mosaic, but now we've got a slight easier way of doing it, because I can use my LRGB mosaic as my registration master for each of my individual mosaic images for the hydrogen alpha. So I can just register them all using this time the match option rather than the union option in Registar to register them up. And now it will just create 10 images straight away that are all the same size as this, with each image in exactly the right position, with padding black around the areas that are not relevant from that image, but needed to match up to the same image size as the ones that were taken elsewhere in the sky. So you just go through this process of blending those images together again, and you get your 10 image H alpha. It's a quicker registration process now. So finally, how to create the final HALRGB. This is the technique I said I would mention. I just thought it might be interesting to you. Some of you may know it, but I find it works the best for me. So in this image, I've got the LRGB as the background. I've imported my HA mosaic into Photoshop, selected it, copied it, and pasted it as a layer 1 over the background image. And I want to create the red of the H alpha with the LRGB. Many tutorials I've read would say, put the H alpha in the red channel of the image, use it to enhance that, put a little bit of it in the blue channel. And I've used that on some images successfully, but I haven't, I'll be honest, I've struggled to make that work reliably and consistently and get good, vibrant detail in the red. So I choose to do something different now. I picked the technique up from a tutorial myself. I didn't create this, but I just thought I'd mention it because I find it works well for the majority of hydrogen alpha with LRGB. And what you do, hydrogen alpha is the black and white layer above the LRGB. What you do at this stage is you put the H alpha in lighten mode. So it's going to blend the H alpha with the LRGB in lighten mode. And what this means is when the H alpha is image is lighter than the background LRGB, it uses the pixel from the H alpha. The LRGB is brighter, it uses the LRGB pixel. And so you can see some areas here where the LRGB shines through, but pretty much because it was a hydrogen alpha dominated background, you're seeing a lot of monochrome black. Well, what we want to do now is we want to take the monochrome black and we want to make it red. So we go to, in Photoshop, you can create something called a hue saturation layer using this little button down the bottom here where my cursor is. And you can create a hue saturation layer. And you would then right click on it and make it something called a clipping mask. And all that means is that hue saturation layer is just going to apply to the H alpha, not the LRGB underneath it. And we're going to bring up in the hue saturation layer box that came up when we created that layer, we're going to click on this colorize button. And what that does is it will change the monochrome black to the color that we choose. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it red. And red is this is a 0 setting out here in this hue slider box. So 0, colorize, and then we're going to adjust the saturation setting to make those gray pixels go red like magic. And now we're starting to see the H alpha is now red. We've artificially made it red, but it really is red. So it's now looking a lot more accurate. We're still seeing some LRGB shine through, which we want, but the H alpha is still dominating too much. So we can go in and we can fix that because we can go back to the layer of H alpha still, and we can use curves to make it a bit darker. And because it's in lighten mode, the darker you make the H alpha, the less of it will show through over the LRGB. And we may, though, want to go a step further by just letting certain bits of the LRGB absolutely 100% shine through because there's a great deal of signal, like in the Rosette Nebula. So the way we do that is, again, using this layer mask technique. And you would create a layer mask for your hydrogen alpha layer. There you can see a reveal all white mask. And we would paint black into the mask using over the image just to let the LRGB signal shine through the H alpha. And we would do it here And we would do it there. And there may be some other places that we want to do that where we don't want as much H alpha to be dominant with its red color. And that then gives you a pretty good image at that stage. And finally, because the hue color of pure red is not quite what H alpha really looks like, it's meant to be kind of a bubblegum pink. The way to get that is you can tweak the final image by going into selective color and just adjusting the magenta slider up on the reds channel and the yellow slider slightly down until it kind of looks right. And that will give you a really good saturated hydrogen alpha LRGB, and it will work pretty much on every H alpha LRGB image you'll do. You've just got to be careful not to overdo the amount of H alpha that shows through in this way, using these two techniques of dimming the H alpha image and then letting things gradually shine through with the mask. So there we are. Final touch on this image would be to dim the stars. The way to do that in Photoshop is select them with a color range tool. Just select highlights in the color range tool up here. Do that selection. The marching ants that will appear at that point with your selection. You then need to expand that selection so that it's a bit bigger than the individual stars by a couple of pixels using the expand selection. 2 pixel setting means it's covering more than the star itself. The marching ants look a lot more visible now. I would then feather that selection so that when we dim the stars, it's going to be nicely blended. And typically you do that by half the expansion factor you use. In this case, it's 1 pixel. And then you use the minimum command. And that kind of dims the background stars way down. And in wide field imaging, I think this is really important because the stars can take away from the nebulosity. And dimming the stars is a final step I would encourage people to do. How much you dim it really is your own taste. You use the minimum tool to do that on the selection of the stars we just did. We had I use a radius of 1 here, I click OK, and you'll see pretty much most of the stars disappeared, and that can be a bit much, taking that many away. But then you can fade that selection or fade that tool effect you just did using the edit fade command, and that brings some of that star content back. You use a slider to say, how much of that minimum filter did I really want to apply? And then you get the balance that you want. It's entirely down to you. But now we've got a nice finished balanced image. So there we go. That was how we built an LRGB with hydrogen alpha, very wide field 10 image mosaic. So I've kind of gone through that quite fast, but you'll have this for replay, and you've also got me with my website address to help you through that. But before I go on to my very last section for 5 minutes, I'm just going to check that everyone can still hear me okay.
Yeah, you're doing great. We do have a few people making some comments about how much they're enjoying this. They're kind of wowed more than anything else. There is a question that we can't quite figure out what it is.
Okay.
Eric, have you figured out what the plate solving question is about yet?
I think the question is, if once you put together this mosaic and you do a plate solve, will it be accurate as if it were a wide field image in a single exposure?
Well, that's a really good question. I've actually tried that, and to be honest, it is actually hard to get a plate solve to work with the final end result mosaic. And I will tell you that is nothing's ever completely perfect here. And the wider because what you're trying to do is you're obviously ending up with a curved field of view, effectively, that's the sky that you're imaging. And you're using the registration software to flatten that curved field of view down into 2 dimensions. And it does a pretty good job of that. It gets the registrations right between the overlapping images. But the further out you go, the less accurate that becomes. And so eventually this iterative technique breaks down, and if you try to do like 4 times as big as this with the iterative technique, you'd find that the registration software starts giving you weird shaped images. They're no longer nice rectangular overlapped images. And it's due to this ever increasing field curvature effect that the errors that it's trying to correct out of that get magnified over time. So the answer to that question is it's pretty hard to get a plate solve to work on a final mosaic image.
A couple of comments I have. Actually, the technique that you discuss is very similar to the one in Photoshop, where you produce a reference image, you reference all of your subs to that image, and then you combine. Their combination is a little bit different than you described, but basically the same thing. You need a template. You want to register the individual images.
Mhm.
Everyone has PixInsight. What Alistair is describing here pretty much applies in PixInsight as well.
And I know that this AstroPixel processor software that looked quite interesting to me has the ability to do this thing, registering, and as well as registering, apparently it does the auto brightness adjustment. So I'm going to try it at some point because it might speed things up.
You know, that is always a trick to feather those in so that your backgrounds really match. The other thing is when your addition of your HA, that's very similar to a technique by Bob Franke, except he uses starless images, so not to influence the color of the stars as well. But it's the same idea, using a lightning layer.
That's okay. So you've just given me an idea. I never thought of taking the stars out of the H alpha image. I might try that. That's an interesting idea.
Well, I tell you from my experience that when you leave them in, you influence the color of the stars.
You do.
And you don't want that. You want your star color to be your star color and your nebulosity to be some form of red. Any other questions?
I had one I'll add one while you're looking, Eric.
Okay.
Alistair, when you were explaining how you defined the targets in the first place, you said that there was the process in the sky that allows you to define the targets, but you prefer to do it by eyeball. Can you explain to me why you prefer doing it by eyeball and all that stuff?
Yeah. So it really it used to be that I had a setup where I had one of those adaptive optics units on my camera. So when I was selecting guide stars, you'd have to have a very bright guide star on the guide chip to be able for that to be able to work. And if I just used a grid that the SkyX produced, I would probably not have had a suitable guide star on every image. So I would use I would more line up my overlaps associated with what was a suitable guide star on my guide chip, while still paying attention to whether I had enough of an overlap with the previous image. And actually, I found that was more wasteful than anything in the end, because what I'd end up having to do is I'd end up with more of an overlap than 20%. And the more overlap you have, the more images you have to take. That's the downside of it. Now I've got a system where pretty much wherever I'm pointed, a guide star will be on my guide chip. So I use the grid command more extensively.
Well, when you say now you've got a system, did you just got a better guider or guide?
I switched from adaptive optics to not using adaptive optics, and I switched to using a guide chip that was in front of the narrowband filters. So it didn't get
basically, okay, you've got different hardware.
Different hardware.
Different hardware that you don't have to worry so much about it being able to find. Now you've got a rotator, obviously.
I did on the old setup. I don't anymore.
Yeah, because it must be really crazy trying to get all those things if you're got different rotations.
Yeah, that is very true. I mean, the good thing about the rotator was you could tell it exactly what angle you wanted, and I always kept it at the same angle. And I was really using the rotator because I had to be very precise about where the guide chip was. And if I had images at different angles to get the guide chip, then yeah, it would get crazy. I'd end up with 7 images where 3 would have been enough without the guide chip.
Yeah. Okay. Modern off-axis guiders and modern guide cameras make things a lot easier.
They do.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Ray's Astrophotography asks if it's possible to take a picture using a telephoto lens and register the individual panels from the telescope. And I suspect that's what you're about to tell us about.
Yes, exactly right. And the answer is yes. And I'm going to show you how you can go way beyond that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Ray's real smart, and he's got the right questions for us, and he's going to be presenting, incidentally, in a couple of weeks. So we appreciate that, Ray.
Yeah.
So go ahead, tell us about it. Eric, set.
I'm sorry, I have a couple more comments or a question. Someone made a comment earlier, if it was only that easy. And I imagine that as your number of panels goes up, the time kind of goes up exponentially. Like if you have a 24, it's a week versus a 6 is a day or an hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, you're quite right. It's a linear, I wouldn't say it's exponential, but it's linear. So the amount of time to do the mosaic is proportional to the number of images. And that is exactly why I started to use this next technique.
Okay, well, go ahead. Sure.
Let's hear about it. We're about ready for that, I think.
All right. This will be quite quick because it's quite simple. So if you want to go wider than that, there's two ways you can do it. You can, like we just said, you can start to take tens of hundreds of images through maybe a 530 millimeter scope, and you can stitch them together. And I've done that, and it is a lot of work. And there's another method, which I've started playing with now for very wide field, which is to take a smaller number of images through a shorter focal length camera lens. So that's the telephoto lens comment. And that gives you a 6x larger field of view than a 530 millimeter telescope. And what you do is you stitch the 85 millimeter images together to form a really wide field image. And then you'd use some images that you've taken of the areas that are really interesting from detail, because not the whole image at very wide field is not going to have a lot of detailed nebulosity in it. There's going to be specific areas. So use your 530 to do the specific areas, and then blend them in to the shorter focal length mosaic. And again, Registar makes that simple. So that's this other technique that I've used. So I'm going to show you a direct example of this, and it got me my first ever APOD last year. So I was like, oh, this is a technique I need to use more often. So here you get 6-image RGB mosaic, 5 hours, like 1 hour per image. That's all it was. Pretty rough processing, but a mosaic, all the seams taken out, just using the iterative process. 7-image H alpha mosaic, 11 hours. This is all taken with a 70 millimeter lens and an 8300 STF camera. So we combine these two images together using that same H alpha technique. Gives you the image on the right. Not a bad image at this point. But now what you can do is, I had all these other images. And by the way, these other images I'd taken over the past 7 or 8 years. I had a Veil Nebula 3-image mosaic, 38 hours worth of data. I had a butterfly mosaic. I had a North American pelican. I had a sharpless mosaic here. And you can take those images and you can use Registar to register them into that wide field image. And it will do it kind of like this. This is a mock-up, but you'll see it will take those bigger images and it will scale them. It will put them in exactly the right spot. It will put them exactly the right size for you to import them into Photoshop as layers above this top image, and then blend them in to give you detail where it's needed, but use the 70 millimeter for the, I would call it the more boring areas out here, whereas there's not a lot, right? So why spend your time doing 20 images down here when all the action's up here? So it's trying to combine the best of both worlds. And so if you use Registar to do that registration, you can take one of these images into Photoshop, and here's the just the 70 millimeter based image. This layer here is actually the Veil Nebula, but I've disabled it at this point here. It's not that the image isn't showing through, and there's a mask on it to prevent it from for me to paint on, to just show through the bits of the Veil Nebula image that I want. And when I click to the next slide, you'll see the effect of that image shining through. Now you'll start to see different colors that were in that high resolution image that have been preserved as we shrink it down, and detail that's been preserved as we shrink it down that we can blend into this eventual image. And after you take everything, all those images in there, there's the original one on the left. Here's the one on the right. And look how much better the North American is compared on the right compared to the left. The Veil Nebula is a lot better. The butterfly has more detail on the right here. The sharpless object down here has a lot more detail. So that was one of my really first attempts at this. And I thought, that there's a lot more you can do with it. So I've persevered on a few more other projects like this now. And I thought I can do better than that. I can do better than the APOD last year, right? So what I did was, this time I did, and this was one of those crazier 530 millimeter mosaics. I did a mosaic of this section entirely at the 530 millimeter mosaic length, all around the North American butterfly complex in pretty much a square like that. But all these images were now actually was through an 85 millimeter lens, just 2 images, a top and a bottom, 2-image mosaic, 85 millimeter background, 20 image central mosaic. This was a single image. This was a new 2-image mosaic that I did. And I had a 2-image mosaic down there, and blended all together. What you notice is your eye doesn't mind the fact that the image here is at a lower resolution. It's drawn to the higher resolution at the center, and it creates quite an interesting 3D effect at the same time, I think. So it's a technique that on the right areas of skies, I think works pretty well. And I did exactly the same with that in full narrow band. So in H alpha S2 and O3, same 20 image mosaic, single image, 2 images, image mosaic down there, combined it all together. It was a lot of hours of data, but it was a manageable mosaic project because I had 25 images for the high res and 2 for the low res. It got an APOD. So it's a technique that I really kind of like to play with now. And just to show you what that technique can do when we go wider, this is now I'm into nested mosaics. I decided if that works, if I can have mosaics in a mosaic, I can have a mosaic in a mosaic in a mosaic. So I can use a really wide angle lens for the really boring stuff here, which is the star background around the Milky Way. That's taken at 14 millimeters. And then I've got some 35 millimeter and 85 millimeter images that I've taken in here, and some high def 530. You'll recognize that Cygnus image from the one on the previous page. And I can blend these all together to create a large field in a lot less images, but without losing too much of the detail. It's not perfect, but it gives you, I think, a pleasing image for a lot less work over an incredibly wide field. And I thought, well, let's try some more narrowband images. I just put this out on the forums this weekend. This was a 9-image at 85 millimeters, 40 images taken through the 530, about 430 hours of imaging time. But all the imaging time was focused around here and around the detail. It wasn't focused out here where there's a lot less to see. So it gives you this context for a lot less imaging time. And I've also did that to produce a narrowband of the Milky Way, much the same as I did with my previous one with the true color, 14 millimeter for the background again through narrowband filters, 85 millimeters for the core of the galaxy. But all these little nebulas in here, all this detail is all at 530 millimeter. And again, it kind of draws your eyes where you want it to be drawn. And it creates a very interesting image in a fraction of the time it otherwise would take. I hate to think what it would take to do an image like this at 530 millimeters. I'd be at it for years and years, just collecting the data, never mind the processing time. And similarly, you can do, here's one I did around Orion, same technique, 9 images this time at 35 millimeters with a camera lens, blending in some images from 70 millimeter camera lenses, 530 Takahashi, and even a 700 Takahashi to create this field of view. And if you really want to take it to the ultimate, there's the full sky, all the way from the southern Milky Way or summer Milky Way here to the winter Milky Way, all taken with different focal lengths, all registered together with Registar to a relatively large degree. And you can just build this up over time, and you can just keep expanding, and it lets you do it and create a very interesting image for a fraction of the time. So that's why I would encourage people, if you've got the capability, and you can use your DSLR for the wide field, very wide field, and use your CCD for the detail like I've been doing, and you can get a great pleasing end result for a lot less effort. Okay, so
What's the size of that final image, the one you're showing?
in terms of, I think in terms of megapixels, it was, I don't know, it was 300,000 or 400,000 megapixels or something. It was some crazy size. It was, but you can see it on my website, and you can scroll through it, and at full resolution, you'll start to see, if you go into the higher resolution, you'll see where I use different focal lengths, because the star sizes are bigger. That's the thing you can't really hide. But when you're zoomed out, you can't tell that that's been done. So it's a trade-off, right? If you want the perfect image, you can do, I don't know how many images I would have had to do at 530 millimeters to do that, but it would have taken probably what's left of my life to get to get this image. I did this image in about 3 months.
So anytime you have multiple telescopes with different focal lengths, you have the ability to use this technique.
Yep.
To get higher resolution on the more interesting areas.
Yep. And there was actually an article about this. I thought, I knew I hadn't invented this technique, because it was kind of, I'd seen other people try it in the past, but it wasn't until I really tried and used it for myself that I realized it was pretty powerful. And then there was just so happened that earlier this year in Astronomy magazine, there was a great article by Steve Canistra, and he wrote up this technique, and I was like, oh, that's the technique that I'm using. And he wrote it up really well. And he actually said this, he said, it brings old images to life. And I think he was exactly right about that, because I have used in some of my images in the last 18 months with this technique, I've gone back and used images I took in 2012 and used them to embed in wider field images, because I had some detail that could be used in a much wider field that I'm now making. And so it's like the ultimate reuse of your old images.
Have you ever thought of printing this for some very large display? Not sure how you do that, but
yeah, I've printed it fairly large on my wall. I've got an image of it. In fact, above me to my top right is the Orion Widefield on a big 3x2 print.
Alex, do you notice any more questions?
Yeah, we do have some more questions. Where do you image from?
I image from Tucson in Arizona. I'm not in a particularly dark area of the sky. I think last time I checked, it was like Bortle 4 or something. And I've started actually to use a lot more to try narrowband out, I think, partly because of that. But the beauty of Tucson for me is, of course, the number of clear nights. That really has helped. And from a guy who was born and lived 40 years in the UK, where to try and get any clear nights for astrophotography is a struggle, it really has enabled me to get a lot of practice.
Okay. That was a question from D. McCallie. And Ray wants to know, do you keep the resolution for the Mosaic 800 by 600 each? Will they become 1600 by 720?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to, let me go back to this image and answer that.
Okay.
So I got asked, well, surely this image is like, it's immense, the number of megapixels is enormous. It isn't, because the governing size of the picture is the lowest resolution image. That the background for this is just a 2-image mosaic. That whole area of sky, all this in the stars, 2 single 40-millimeter images, which means the whole image size is only something like 10,000 by 2,000 pixels. So you can't, and what I do is I reduce the size of all these to the lowest common denominator background size. So effectively, they're being scrunched down by the registration software to fit into the lowest resolution image.
You could do it the other way around as well. You could scale it up to the better resolution.
You could. That is a fair point. So I thought about this, and you're right. You could.
Then you would have massive files, wouldn't you?
Well, you would, but it's surprising what you can do these days in Photoshop. You can get pretty big and still be okay. I could do bigger than this for sure. So maybe not scaling up to the full size, but scaling somewhere into the middle. And I thought about this after, I actually sat there after I'd done probably about half this image. And I thought, you know, I could have done it the other way around. At that point, I was like, no, I'm just going to keep going. I'm not going to rewind and undo what I did. But I think your point is exactly valid. You could scale up the 14 millimeter image carefully, so you didn't, you know, it didn't look like it was too pixelated or anything. And you could meet somewhere in the middle. I think that would work.
Photoshop does a reasonable job of upscaling as long as you don't get too close to the image.
Yep.
When you do your Hubble palette images, do you use tone mapping, or is it just combination of SHO? Or
The way I do it was I picked up a technique in a book called Lessons from the Masters. I only started my first narrowband images about 18 months ago. And what I do is I take the hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen. I use the Hubble palette. And what I do is I use that H alpha technique that you colorize each layer, right? So the H alpha is red, the sulfur is red, the H alpha is the green, colorized green, the O3 is blue. And then you just combine those together as different layers using the screen blend mode in Photoshop, and it projects the different colors together. And then you just use curves on each one till it looks about right. It's a kind of more subjective way of doing it. But it gets you the colors pretty fast, and it works fairly well for me.
so you don't use a luminosity layer, you just combine the three?
I combine the three, and then I do on a number of the images now. I use the hydrogen alpha layer as the luminosity, because it's the higher resolution, higher fidelity image because of the signal strength, and I use hydrogen alpha as a luminance layer over the SHO that I combined for the color.
Ali wants to know, what if we use very wide lens for narrowband? The resolution would be less, but it'd save hours, and the result might still.
That's what I did here. That's exactly what I did here. This here, in fact, all of this, other than the detail, all this color was an 85 millimeter camera lens through narrowband filters. It works fine.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, if you could put a wide enough field of view on your telescope, why would you need to make mosaics?
Just for the detail.
Just for the detail, so that you can get more detail.
Yeah, because if you took this same image, just with the 14 millimeter lens, it's going to look like a standard. It's going to look like a standard DSLR Milky Way. It's not. You're not going to be able to see. You're not going to see all this detail, and that you can just, even at this zoomed out, you can tell the detail in there, and you just wouldn't get that level of detail unless you did the mosaic at 530 millimeters. Even at 85 millimeters, that does not look as impressive as it does with this technique.
It's the detail. The rest of the higher resolution.
Your higher resolution follows the detail, and that's where you use it to the best effect.
Okay. Get your questions in, folks, because looks like we're getting close to wrapping up.
What profile you use? What color profile you use on your images?
Whatever the standard is in Photoshop. Is that sRGB?
sRGB or 1966 or 1998?
I think it's sRGB. Whatever the default is in Photoshop, I've never changed it.
Okay. Joe, are you still here? Can you turn your mic on and tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about next week?
Hey, Alex. Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. And your video on, so we can see that too.
Oh, yeah.
This is Joe De Pasquale, and tell us who you are. Just 2 minutes at most, you know.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say, Alistair, that was a really great presentation.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna join and see yours.
Great. So I'm Joe De Pasquale. I'm a senior science visuals developer at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. I am the guy making the Hubble images for the press releases that we put out. So next week I'm going to talk a little bit about history of Hubble and how it's been up for 30 years now. It's kind of amazing. There's like a whole generation of people who their understanding of the universe and the cosmos is like driven by all the visuals from Hubble. So I'm going to talk a little bit about its history and then a little bit about the process of how we go through taking the raw data from the telescope and turning it into press release imagery.
Okay, I hope everybody can come back next week and join us. And we should have a good time doing all that stuff. I think we've got all the questions out there, don't we, Eric?
Yeah, I think we do. Well, a lot of very positive comments, Alistair. I mean, everyone enjoyed it. Just fantastic pictures. Let me just say, my 2 cents, they're beautiful.
Thank you very much. And if anybody's got any questions, my email address is on my website. In fact, if you just type my name into Google, my website will come up and you can find me there.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for your preview of next week. Remember, anybody who has any buddies or themselves who would like to give a presentation, we are always looking for presenters. So be sure to go to our contact page on the astroimagingchannel.org and volunteer yourself, okay? And if you haven't yet subscribed to the Astro Imaging channel on YouTube, please do that. We want a Christmas present. We want to be at 10,000 by Christmas, and we're about 200 away. So please go ahead and sign up. If you want to keep getting presentations like the kind Alistair did tonight and Joe's going to be doing next week, hey, sign up. Okay, subscribe. Thank you very much for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to the boss again. Molly, you want to take us out?
Alistair, you can hang with us after the show is over. So stay tuned.
Okay.
All right. Have a good night, all.